Hey y'all, we need to talk about your pelvic floor's role during labor because to really understand how to prepare for labor and delivery and to prepare your pelvic floor for labor and delivery, first we need to know what your pelvic floor is actually supposed to be doing during your labor and delivery. Before we jump into it, I want to direct you to the free download link that's in the description of this video. It's a link to my Birth Wishes worksheet, which is just a worksheet you can use to go through and see what your options are during labor and delivery and help you decide what's a priority, what your preferences are with you and your partner. So make sure you check out that free download. But now let's jump into it and learn all about your pelvic floor during labor and delivery. Okay, the role of your pelvic floor during labor and delivery is to get out of the way. So a lot of times people think about pelvic floor pushing baby out or needing a really strong pelvic floor to prepare for labor and delivery. And overall, it's great to have a strong pelvic floor no matter what. And a strong pelvic floor doesn't necessarily mean, it's not like the opposite of a pelvic floor that knows how to relax. But at the end of the day, what our pelvic floor needs to do during labor, so the whole time you're laboring, your uterus is contracting, baby is getting pushed down further and further into your pelvis, working through birth canal. We are getting more and more dilated in the cervix, all of those good things during labor. And then especially for delivery, when we're pushing baby out, this pelvic floor just needs to know how to relax and get the heck out of the way. So when we think about the uterus contracting from up above and really helping to push baby further and further down, these pelvic floor muscles are the exact opposite of the force that your contractions are. So we don't want a pelvic floor that's super active and super strong and working really hard during labor and delivery. We want a pelvic floor that gets out of the way so that those contractions can be really efficient, and so that in the pushing phase, when you're pushing and you're pushing with those contractions, we don't have something that's fighting against all of that effort that you're doing to push baby out. So what does it mean for the pelvic floor to get out of the way? It means that these muscles need to know how to lengthen really well. So if you think about those pelvic floor muscles, sometimes I call them the pelvic bowl because they sit in that bowl shape or that hammock shape at the bottom of your pelvis. We want those muscles, instead of shortening like what happens when we contract them or do a Kegel, we want those muscles to lengthen, because the more that they lengthen, the more that they're relaxing and getting out of the way, so that they're not fighting against your contractions and fighting against your pushing. So the next question is, how can we prepare for and train the pelvic floor to do what it's supposed to do during labor and delivery? The very first thing that we practice in prenatal prep or getting ready for labor and delivery is breathing. So we want to know that we can use the breath appropriately, and that when we take those nice, good diaphragmatic inhales, that breath and that inhale are reaching these muscles, because when an inhale reaches these muscles, they are automatically designed to lengthen because they are accepting that air. They're cushioning that air in. And so that is sending them the signal that, hey, it's time to lengthen and get out of the way. So the more we practice that really great diaphragmatic breath, learn what it feels like to feel that breath reach all the way to the pelvic bowl, and to feel those muscles accept the breath and lengthen out of the way. And the more we practice it leading up to labor and delivery, then we have that really great breathing pattern to use during labor and delivery, especially during contractions. So when I'm working with a mom and helping her get ready for labor and delivery, and we're training that piece of it, that's the breath that we're talking about using. And we're practicing it even before contractions get intense, but especially as those contractions start to get more and more intense, when they're at their peak, if we can stay tapped into a deep breathing pattern and a pattern that we can feel reach these pelvic floor muscles, then we know that when it matters most, when that uterus is contracting and trying to push baby out and through the pelvis or through the birth canal, then we know that we're using our breath appropriately to signal to those muscles to get out of the way, so that we have less of a chance of those muscles fighting against the contraction and more of a chance of them getting out of the way, so that the contraction can do its job really well. The second thing that we can use to help those muscles learn how to lengthen and get out of the way are prenatal stretches. So a lot of the prenatal stretches that you will find on the internet that your pelvic floor PT or your doula or your midwife or whoever might direct you in doing, all of those are directed at opening the pelvis. And when this pelvis opens, when it's a pelvic opener, then these muscles are also getting put on stretch. Here's how I coach my pelvic floor patients and my labor and delivery workshop participants. Here's how I coach them during those stretches though. We aren't going to do a stretch that's so intense that it is going to physically add length to the muscle. We're not taking a muscle that's too short and suddenly just changing the structure of it and lengthening it. What we are doing is putting a muscle on a little bit of a stretch and breathing into it and waiting and training our nervous system and training our brain to allow the stretch to happen. So the point of prenatal stretching isn't necessarily to add length to the muscles so that the more length is there during labor and delivery, the more that they'll get out of the way. It's to train the muscles that when something causes them to stretch, like a contraction and like a push as baby is passing through those muscles, we want those muscles trained to allow the lengthening or allow the stretching to happen instead of tensing up or fighting against it. So I want you to start to think of prenatal stretching more as muscle retraining than actually stretching or adding length to the muscles, because we know through research that that's not even what's happening when we stretch a muscle, but we can train them to say, hey, when a little bit of a tension is added here, or when a stretch or a lengthening force is added, just let it happen instead of trying to fight it or see it as something that is dangerous that you need to fight against. So we're retraining those pelvic floor muscles, we're retraining the brain and the nervous system during those prenatal stretches so that when it's go time during labor and delivery, we're used to it and we already know what it feels like to let the lengthening happen instead of fight against it. Another trick that I really like to have people use to practice letting the pelvic floor get out of the way, practice keeping that diaphragmatic breath as they get ready for labor and delivery, is the ice trick. So this is all over the place. This is not my idea. This is something that lots and lots of birth educators teach on. But if you were to hold an ice cube in your fist, we know that the ice goes through C-bands. So first it's cold, then it feels like it's burning, then it starts to get a little bit achy, and then it goes numb. That's kind of the progression when you're icing something, like icing an injury. But if you were to hold an ice cube in your hand, and as it goes through those stages and gets more and more uncomfortable, you're practicing staying relaxed. So you're practicing feeling those breaths, not letting those breaths get into that shallow chest, kind of like panicked breathing, right? Because that's gonna not get down to the pelvic floor and not give that signal to the pelvic floor to lengthen and get out of the way. So we're practicing keeping that diaphragmatic breath, that we feel reaching the pelvic bowl, that we feel relaxing and lengthening the pelvic bowl. We're practicing not clenching through the jaw, hunching up in the shoulders, or clenching in the pelvic floor. So as things start to get uncomfortable with that ice, can we leave everything relaxed? Even though it's getting uncomfortable, can we remind our nervous system, remind our body, you're safe. You don't need to clench against this. You don't need to protect against this. You can stay relaxed into it. And as it gets more and more uncomfortable, then we're just keeping that breathing steady, keeping that breathing deep, and keeping everything relaxed. The other piece that I like to point out is we're also not clenching the ice, especially during contractions. Like, all of that is important. If we're clenching the jaw, clenching our fists, clenching our shoulders, then we're probably also clenching pelvic floor. So when it gets really uncomfortable and it's hard to tell what your pelvic floor is doing, it's usually a little bit easier to see what like up here is doing and be a little bit more aware of that. So as that ice cube gets really, really uncomfortable, can you leave your hold around the ice cube soft, just holding the ice, not squeezing it and clenching it and just gritting your teeth and trying to get through it? That's really good practice for how a contraction gets more and more intense until it reaches its peak. Can we stay relaxed, breathing deeply, all of those things as the contraction builds? Not that not that the uncomfortableness of ice anywhere matches the uncomfortableness of a contraction, but it still trains us and trains our nervous system and trains our brain to not see everything as danger that we need to clench and guard against. Last but not least, there's also things that we are hoping that you're doing during labor and during delivery to help encourage these pelvic floor muscles to get out of the way so that they're not fighting against or countering the work that all of those really great uterine contractions are doing. And that's where labor and delivery positions come in. That's a big piece of what I talk about in my labor and delivery workshops, are how to work through positions, what positions are right for you, how your partner can help you with that. But when we think labor and delivery positions, we're thinking, what are the positions that sets your body up to allow that pelvic floor to get out of the way? What positions really help open your pelvis so that your pelvic floor can start to get that signal that it's like, hey, it's time to lengthen and get out of the way and not fight these contractions. One of the things that I always want you to do, no matter what position you're in, is look for what can you give your weight to, or what can you relax into when it's time for a contraction. So even in those early stages of labor, when you're probably still laboring at home, you might be up and about doing things around the house still because contractions are still pretty spread out. They're not as intense. I want you to have an exit plan, whether it's at the hospital or you're at home, for, hey, you can be up and moving around. We really want that. That helps baby. That helps labor continue to progress. That helps baby make his or her way through the birth canal. But when a contraction comes on, can you give your weight to something? Can you give your weight to your partner, to the birthing ball, to a chair, to the bed? Whatever it is, if you can give your weight to something during a contraction, then you're much more likely to be able to get that pelvic floor out of the way and keep your breathing being that lengthening breathing. Because if you're holding yourself up against gravity, if you're standing or sitting or kneeling or whatever it is, and you're trying to hold yourself up against gravity, it's a lot harder to hold yourself up against gravity and also let everything go and let everything lengthen. So no matter what the position is, and no matter what you learn about mobility and moving around and positioning during labor and delivery, we're always thinking, okay, but what's my exit plan when a contraction comes on, and what can I give my weight to so that I can set my body up to be able to just lengthen and relax and get out of the way of that contraction. So that's just a little tidbit of what the heck your pelvic floor is supposed to be doing during labor and delivery, how you can train it and practice so that you feel a little bit more confident knowing how to use your pelvic floor during labor and delivery. If you want to see a little bit more about things that you should start thinking through for your labor and delivery to decide what's important to me, what's not so important to me, what are my preferences for this labor and delivery, then I want to direct you again to my free birth wishes worksheet that is linked in the description of this video. It's a free PDF download. It is a worksheet of all of the different options you could think through for labor and delivery. Some people call it a birthing plan. I prefer to call it birthing wishes, but it gives you a tool for you and your partner to go through together and really decide what's important to you, what's most important for your body, for your baby, and for the labor and delivery experience that you want to create. And then it also gives you a great tool once it's filled out to discuss those options with your birthing team to have with you in the room during your labor and delivery, and just gives you a tool for communication with your birthing team. So that is available for you in the downloads, and I hope this was super helpful. I hope it helps you think through a few things you can start doing to prepare for labor and delivery, and I will see you next week.